Welcome back to Biology with Mrs. Evans. In the last video, we ended with the octet rule. I want to review that again using these images. Remember, there are different electron levels in an atom. The first level can hold only 2 electrons. The second and third level can hold 8 each. Atoms want to be stable, which means they want these levels to be full. To achieve this, atoms will gain, lose, or share electrons. Let's look at sodium and chlorine. I have clipped the parts of the periodic table that contain these two elements. Notice sodium is in group 1A, and remember the group number tells you the number of electrons that are in the outermost shell. So sodium has 1, and chlorine is in group 7, so that tells you that chlorine has 7 electrons in the outermost shell. In the last video, we also talked about the atomic number. Notice that the atomic number of sodium is 11, which tells you that sodium has 11 protons and 11 electrons. Chlorine has an atomic number of 17, so it has 17 protons and 17 electrons. The picture you see centered in the middle of the screen is what we call a Bohr model. A Bohr model shows you the electron configuration for the different elements. Now, let's just review. Remember, first electron level only wants 2. Notice sodium only has 2 in its first level. Same with chlorine. It only has 2. The second level, remember, wants 8 electrons. So you'll notice that both sodium and chlorine have 8 electrons in their second shell. The third shell, if you notice for sodium, only has 1 electron, and chlorine has 7 electrons. Because sodium only has 1 electron in its outer shell, it's easier for it to lose this electron than it is to try to gain 7 electrons or share 7 electrons. Chlorine has 7 electrons, so it's easier for it to gain 1 electron than it would be to lose 7 electrons. When sodium gives away its 1 electron, it gains a positive charge, because remember, electrons are negatively charged. Chlorine gains the electron, so it's going to become negatively charged. Sodium then becomes a positive ion, and chlorine becomes a negative ion. These two ions are attracted to one another because of the opposites of their charge. This forms an ionic bond. So some vocabulary that are related to ions are cations, and that's what sodium would be. A cation is a positively charged ion, and an anion is a negatively charged ion. So when elements gain or lose an electrons, they become ions. The attraction between the opposite charges is what forms ionic bonds. Ionic bonds are not the only type of chemical bonds. You have covalent bonds, and you notice here that in covalent bonds, electrons are being shared. So these electrons here are the ones that are being shared. And then you have hydrogen bonds, which is the weakest of the three, and that is basically formed from, again, an attraction between a positive of one molecule and the negative of another molecule. And we'll go into more detail about hydrogen bonds in a separate video. Alright, so let's look at covalent bonds. Covalent bonds, you need to know, are the strongest bonds. It takes a lot of energy to break the bonds between molecules that are formed from covalent bonding. In a covalent bond, again, just remember covalent bonds are formed when electrons are shared between atoms. Example of compounds that have these type of bonds: water, glucose. A special type of covalent bond that you need to know is a peptide bond. A peptide bond is a bond that is found only in proteins, and it is the bond that links the two amino acids together. And we'll go into more detail about that when we talk about the different types of macromolecules. We started this video with talking about ionic bonds. You need to know that ionic bonds are weaker than covalent bonds, because remember, they are formed from the attraction of the positive of one element and the negative of another element. this is formed again when electrons are transferred from one atom to another, creating the two different types of ions. When atoms lose or gain electrons, their overall charges change. So just know if they give up one electron, they're getting a +1 charge. Sometimes they can give up 2 electrons, so they'll get a +2 charge. And the opposite would be if they gained an electron, they're getting a -1 charge, and if they gained 2 electrons, they would be getting a -2 charge. Alright, so let's just review ionic bonds again. This is another image that shows how ionic bonds are formed. Notice that sodium and chlorine themselves are not charged, because remember, elements are not charged because they have equal number of protons and equal number of electrons. So there's no charge on the two natural occurring elements. However, when sodium gives up its one electron in its outer shell, so this electron is going to give it to chlorine. When it does that, it gains a +1 charge because now it has 11 protons and only 10 electrons. And chlorine, on the other hand, is going to gain an electron, so it is now going to have an overall -1 charge. So again, you need to know the term for a positively charged ion is a cation, and a negatively charged ion is a anion.